in New York, and this really is a continuation of that conversation.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you. Well, I hope everybody had a nice lunch. We're going to try to get you leaning forward rather than back and snoozing. I'm going to ask my panelists to just come out, and then I'm going to do a little bit of a setup. But so as I'm sure many of you know, the nature and future of work has been an ongoing topic of discussion at Techonomy over the years. So I want to throw out like 10 quick facts to kind of focus us on the moment and the issues that we face right now about it. Number one is 10 years ago was the start of the Great Recession. In fact, it has its birthday next month in case anyone wants to plan a party. But since that time, the economy has sort of clawed its way back toward prosperity. And in the process, 16 million new jobs have been created in a workforce of about 160 million people. That's number one. Number two is we've gone from peak unemployment of about 10% in this cycle to what the economists euphemistically call full employment, which means only 4% of people are unemployed. That's number two. Number three, even more good news, is that after many years of stagnation, wages are up. Who knew? Median wages in full-time jobs have actually trended higher for the past couple of years. And yet, as we're all aware, there are lots of cross-currents and instabilities in the workplace and in the workforce, which is why we titled this panel the way we've titled it, The Uncertain, Unstable, Changing Nature of Work. Number three is that most, maybe all of the net job growth is in so-called contingent jobs. I think everybody knows what those are, but it's basically contract workers, independent freelancers, on-call workers, help agency workers. And by the way, did you know that more and more American families are moonlighting as well? Next fact, the New York Times ran a piece a few weeks ago that 1.5 million workers have disappeared from the workforce. Presumably they dropped out with the recession and just haven't come back, but nobody has quite pinned it down yet. Number 6, I think I'm on, is despite the median wage increase, there's something to what the Atlantic Monthly recently described as, quote, slow, continual downward pressure on the value and availability of work in America. That's as expressed mainly in full-time jobs. Okay, next point. Employers, including, I'm sure, companies represented here in this room, have been complaining and struggling to find workers that have the right skills for the jobs they need. Number 8, there's this ongoing and very mysterious sluggishness in new business formation and job creation. And I hope we come back to that. I think it's a central topic, and I know people here in our group have a lot to say about it. Number 9, there's this phenomenon of what might be called taskification going on, all up and down the work spectrum, from professionals to white-collar to blue-collar to pink-collar to no-collar jobs. There's fragmentation of jobs into tasks, and some of those tasks are eminently automatable and done better by machines. And then finally, there's this issue of the morale of working people, also all up and down the spectrum. In a recent report, Intuit described, quote, a high baseline level of insecurity surrounding jobs, income, and benefits among American workers. So if that's not a confusing picture, I don't know what is. But that's why we're here today. Some of these effects are cyclical. Some of them point to permanent shifts in the nature of work, many of them driven by technology. But at this moment of boom and of full employment, it's really hard to tell things apart. And that's why we're going to have this panel, to try to tease apart some of the strands, to surface some ideas, and see if we can shed some light. So on my panel here, which may be a record number for Techonomy, I don't know, but I think we're going to be happy about it. Each of my panelists is very accomplished in his or her own right. Plus, each person on the stage has deep expertise in the question of work from a completely different facet from anybody else on the panel. So we have 5 completely different outlooks, and we're going to see those compare and contrast as we go along. So let me just quickly introduce people, and then we'll get going. So let me start with Paul Roehrig, who is the Chief Strategy Officer of Cognizant Digital Business. He was also founder of the Center for the Future of Work at Cognizant, and he's a writer. His latest book, What to Do When Machines Do Everything, we have copies here, and I hope people pick them up. It's a terrific book full of interesting and provocative thoughts and observations. So, Paul, welcome.
Thanks.
Sheila Lirio Marcello is a founder. She's a founder and CEO of Care.com, which is the largest platform on the internet for family care. And family care means, you name it. It means elder care, it means child care, it means pet care, it means house care. It's a platform for independent care workers to link up with jobs. So welcome, Sheila. Sasan Goodarzi is the executive vice president at Intuit, and you know Intuit from TurboTax and QuickBooks. Intuit serves millions and millions of households and small businesses and has deep insight into what those customers are up to, and they need to do that to keep their products current. So we'll be tapping into some of that knowledge and insight from you. Welcome. Deanna Farrell. Deanna had a long, distinguished career running the McKinsey Global Institute. She then did a stint at the Obama White House as a deputy director of the National Economic Council, and then came back to found her own institute at J.P. Morgan Chase, where she's the founder and CEO. And, excuse me, finally, Byron August, who is our only walking, talking labor economist on stage. Oxford trained. He had a long, distinguished career at McKinsey as well and wrote for the McKinsey Global Institute. He then also did a stint at the Obama White House as a deputy director of the National Economic Council. And now he runs a startup, which is called Opportunity at Work, and we'll hear a little bit about that later. But to get us going, and since we're kind of in exploration mode this afternoon, I'm just going to ask one question and ask for a brief answer from each of our 5 discussants. And then if there's anybody on the floor that wants to throw in an answer to the same question, just raise your hand. We're going to start the discussion immediately, okay? We're not going to wait till the end. So here's the question. So here we are at this moment of what the economists call full employment. Can you name a single thing that you find most puzzling about the nature of work in America and the job market today? So I'm going to start with Paul, and is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
All right. So fire away.
The single most puzzling thing to me is there's a zeitgeist of fear and concern. When you look back historically at every major shift in business and technology, there's been an interregnum where people are afraid of the technology, either concerned or out and out afraid of new technology and what it's going to mean. It could have been the Luddites. It could have been, you can go back thousands of years and find history. And we're in that, I think we're in that space right now. So the most puzzling thing for me, and we touch on it in the book a little bit, is this sense of apprehension and concern. It feels very much like, when you read the news, whether it's political news or work news or economic or technology news, there's a sense of things are not going really well. And so I'm puzzled and entranced by that, context.
Why won't people take some good news?
Well, you don't want to trivialize and say, everything's great, but there is a sense of opportunity and possibility, and I think that's being turned down more than I think it should be.
Okay, great, thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. The most puzzling thing for me is actually how we undervalue care in the society when it is the foundation and the infrastructure that actually drives jobs and thus the economy. From a demand side, it's $320 billion. It's one of the fastest growing job category that supports all work. And if you're wondering in the audience, like, does it even pertain to me? So how many of you have kids? How many of you have been nieces and nephews? How many of you have been children? So I often ask that question when I'm public speaking because people don't think that the care relates to them, but the senior tsunami that's coming of 10,000 that's becoming 65 years or older, it's upon us. And we don't think about it. But yet on the supply side, we undervalue this infrastructure. I mean, we invest in roads and bridges, but yet what drove the economy and overall GDP growth was really female participation in the workplace in the last 4 years.
So we'll put a marker in that.
So
We're gonna come back
pretty
to that.
puzzling for me.
Very good. Sasan.
So just to humanize it, you've got folks today that they have a full-time job and they may do Uber going and coming back to work, or all they do all day long is do work, whether it's Care.com, Upwork, DoorDash. Their whole entire life is doing different gigs. And for me, and by the way, our entire United States system does not support these folks in terms of how we do paychecks, insurance, benefits, everything. And the most puzzling thing to me when you talk to these folks is on one end, they absolutely love the freedom of being able to do what they want to do when they want to do it. On the other hand, they are extremely concerned about the lack of stability of pay. And that's very puzzling to me because there's a love-hate relationship that folks have in this gig economy.
So this is a hard question because I think there are many topics, and each one of the ones you've raised is good. But I think the one that I have not seen a good explanation for, and I certainly have spent a lot of time trying to think hard about it, you alluded to it, Peter, in your 10 factors of the economy, but it is what has really been a 40-year structural decline in startups in America. And of course, this last recession, made it terrible, but you just have to zoom out to say, 1978, the rate of new startups was about 15% of the base. That's 800,000 jobs were being created every year by people starting up new. Today, that number is 8%, fewer than 500 jobs. And, you had a little bit of an up and tip, but it's been a structural decline.
Yeah, we heard John Chambers talk pretty passionately about
this
today.
topic, and I thought he was very interesting, but I was not fully compelled by his explanations. And so I would say, just quickly, because I know we'll come back to some of this.
Well, hold your explanation. I'm
Okay.
going to come back and ask you about that.
So I think really getting behind that, at the same time that the exit rates have not changed, that creates a very clear problem for the structure of our economy.
Okay, great. Byron?
Thanks. I think it's not surprising that people feel afraid because I think half of Americans certainly have been living through a very long and deep recession. I mean, a multi-decade recession effectively in their household incomes. But what I do find surprising is the sense of fatalism among elites, if you will, across the board about the future of work. I mean, work is solving problems. And last I checked, we were not running out of problems. I mean, work is building things, it's fixing things, it's inventing, it's caring, it's entertaining, it's educating. There's so much work to do. There's so much high-value work to do. I mean, there's so much high net present value investment to be done in infrastructure in so many different phases of industry and invention. And there's extremely high socially value caring work to be done, which, by the way, I think has something to do with the entrepreneurship problem when you have the disappearing fabric of care that provides the risk management underneath that. So I think we need to really look beyond. Too much of our debate treats technology as if it's a force of nature, and technology will do X or technology will do Y, or it'll take this job or that job, and too much of it treats our institutions as static. Newsflash, we are in charge of our institutions. We can change them. So if our institutions, whether it's our capital markets or our labor markets or education, are not doing what's required to help us unlock the kind of investment in sort of the high-value work we need to do, then we need to change them. And so that's where I think I'd like to focus the conversation.
Okay, so we've got zeitgeist of fear and concern. We've got the undervaluing of care. We've got the love-hate relationship about contingent work, you know, do it yourself, put together, cobble together a living. We've got the 40-year decline in startups, and we've got fatalism and passivity, really, among elites about dealing with how to configure the workforce so it works better. Now, anybody else want to throw one in? Can you bring up the house lights, please, so we can actually see people? There we are. Okay. Hi, guys.
I'd like to pose a simple question. What would an ordinary workday look like in the year 2035?
Oh, and that's a good one. That's one we may want to end on today. But that's a really good question. You want to add one on the list?
Yeah. The productivity thing I mentioned earlier, which is we've got all these technologies that are supposed to be making us more productive. Excuse me. We have all these technologies that are supposed to be making us more productive, and yet for the last decade plus, the productivity numbers have actually declined and are the lowest in a century.
Right. Okay. With all this automation, how come productivity is not going up? Okay. Well, that's a good place to start, actually, Paul, because I know that you, in your book, would probably argue that we're not automating and working on processes fast enough. There's not enough investment going in, and investment is what drives productivity.
Right.
Okay.
Oh, it's exactly right. The idea. So you've asked the question twice. I think it's one of the right questions to ask in terms of why aren't these numbers being recognized in terms of productivity improvements? And you know, technologists talking about how great technology is in the shadow of Silicon Valley is not particularly surprising, right? But the question does come back to, okay, well, where's the impact? And I'm not sure that there's not an impact, or whether it's, and you know, maybe Byron can help us. I'm not sure that we're measuring the right things in terms of technology and the impact, the productivity impact that I think is occurring. The idea around automation and in fact AI overall is that it is the next generation of productivity improvement. It is the system that can allow a higher degree of throughput in most business processes and customer experiences. And that is starting to, when you look at the evidence and what different companies are doing across different sectors, that is what's beginning to show up. You're seeing new commercial models, you're seeing valuations change, and other proxy measures to productivity.
Great. So that's a theme that's come up a couple times already, is that we're not valuing things and measuring things in a way that's quite appropriate. Byron, you said something when we were talking on the phone that completely blew my mind. I've been obsessed with it ever since, which is that you were speaking as a labor economist, and you said that the way that work is valued in labor economics is like the way that money and investing was valued in classical, in standard economics, when the idea was that investors will always make the rational choice. Now, classical economics had a revolution of behavioral economics come in with Kahneman and those guys, and it's a lot more sophisticated now because it takes humans into account. But you said that has not happened in labor economics, and it sounds to me like there's a Nobel Prize just sitting out there waiting for somebody to pick it up. But
right.
Could you explain what's missing there?
Yeah, the Nobel Prize would probably go to someone who's working on a model right now, not sitting on a panel. But yeah, yeah. But the point I was making was that well, you know, Richard Thaler just won the Nobel Prize for sort of behavioral economics applied mainly to investment, saving decisions, consumption decisions, about the psychology of how people actually work and what they care about. And my point was that there's an even more fundamental disconnect between the way people are modeled as workers in the standard economic model that has not been disentangled, and I think we're not going to really understand the situation we're facing until we disentangle it. So to slightly oversimplify, but not by much, when you do the demand and supply, if you think of the labor market as a market, companies that want people to work to build products, that's the demand side, right? So they're doing something useful. People, it turns out, in this case, are the supply side, the way it's modeled. So you offer your labor because you are paid. If you weren't paid, you wouldn't offer your labor. And specifically, the underlying assumption is that working per se is a negative. It's a bad thing, right? But you do it in exchange for it's something you give up your time. Your leisure time is what's valuable. You give up your leisure time to work because you get money for it. That's the underlying. That's under the microeconomics underlying all of our labor market models. Is that? But from psychology, we know that in fact having meaningful work is sort of a top three, right? It's right at the base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, along with loving relationships, along with care and shelter for someone's actual utility and well-being. So how can it be that something that's actually a fundamental input into someone's well-being, that people have a deep demand for, in fact, meaningful work, is something that our entire intellectual infrastructure around labor markets and work treats as a negative that you only do in exchange for money. And until we disentangle that, I think we don't have much of a chance of really understanding what's going on in the labor markets.
So what would be a meaningful policy change that would come out of changing this economic thinking?
Well, I think
just give me one.
Okay. So if you took that very seriously, meaningful work is an input into people's fundamental well-being and happiness and completeness as people, you would take very, very seriously policies that made less disruption of working, even if someone had to leave a particular job. So, for example, in Germany, they have job sharing arrangements for the recession. In the United States, it used to be over the first 5 recessions after World War II. Companies only laid off about 1/3 of the number of people they would have needed to keep their profits stable. Now it's 100%, so it's about 9-10 million more people that were laid off this last recession than if we had kept the same arrangements as the first 5 recessions after World War II in this country. We're not taking seriously the cost of disruption, not just to the macroeconomy, but to fundamental well-being and to fundamental skill sets, because most of your skills we develop at work, not just at school. And what's more, if you're out of work for 6 months, you're considered damaged goods and it's hard to get back in. Well, if 10 million people get laid off at the same time, well, a lot of them are going to be out of work 6 months later. So we are letting this drift happen that throws more and more people off the bus and puts them out of meaningful work. And we don't need to do that. Our institutions don't have to work that way. There are different ways we could do them, and we should change them on purpose.
Can I chime in?
Yes,
on
please.
this? I also think Byron mentioned, the challenge around institutions being a public company and the focus we have on short term and this EBITDA, operating income focus that really is about reducing labor as much as we can to drive overall productivity. Instead, if we were focused on long-term growth and investment, on creativity, value, and what's important to human beings, and we gave that long-term focus and allowed that growth, the numerator to grow rather than the denominator to decrease, we'd actually improve productivity in this country. And so it's an interesting thing around our capitalist institutions as well, for scale and where we find our monies, has a value set that is also counter to overall improving of productivity that supports what's important to humans.
Mm-hmm. Peter, to your question, I think you're right, Byron, that we would think very differently about this if we didn't treat this as a supply issue, but as a need. I think the best policy focus that would bring to light would be if you look at the employment numbers and you subsegment, because it's never useful to look at aggregate numbers, you start seeing that there are different issues that are just not getting attention. The biggest and most obvious one related to what you worry about all the time, Sheila, is daycare for women. I mean, there's a reason that labor force participation has really become stagnant for women, is that there's a structural problem. And if we sort of thought, no, it's really important for women to work, not just because they're suppliers of work, but because it's part of who they are and their identity, we would solve that problem. You look at our criminal laws and the ways in which we've taken kids in the inner city who had some drug run-in or another and labeled them criminals and basically kept them out of the workforce for 10, 15 years. Right. We would solve that. We have an opioid crisis that is a health issue that is keeping a lot of people out of the we would solve it. We wouldn't just call it an emergency and then turn away and pretend nothing was happening. And I think that we aren't being creative enough about understanding where are the pockets of real problems with either labor force participation or employment, and policies that are going to be very targeted to bringing people back into the fold and also back into the workforce, because that's an issue. Our unemployment rate is 4%, but our underemployment rate and people who have discouraged is much higher. And we can solve this if we had a very different mindset towards it.
Now, Sasan, I want to jump. Were you going to throw something into this? Because I had a different question for you.
I was going to, but let me see what your question is. It may be.
Well, my question is that you have a microscope. I mean, even to survive as a company, you have to understand how small businesses and households are managing. And, you know, what we're hearing is that people are cobbling together jobs, their retirement security has gone to hell. I mean, a lot of factors have shifted among your customers. And you guys not only can see how they use the software and what they respond to in terms of the tools you provide, but the research that you've supported as a company has really looked at household patterns in very interesting ways. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, like what you've uncovered.
Sure. I'll start with actually what we're experiencing as a company, and then I'll hit on the customer piece in a moment. So we have 8,000 full-time employees, but at our peak during any year, we hit almost 15,000. And the 15,000 are actually, they're all contingent workers to be able to support as we go through what we call busy season globally. And so what that's actually taught us is our payroll systems, how we engage them. You know, one of the things that we do is we make sure that we pay our contractors net 10 days. Versus most folks pay them the normal 45 days. And you can't, these folks that are contingent workers, they have a hard time surviving. So as a company, because we hire so many of the contingent workers, we're actually learning how to operate differently to make sure that we can help them with their well-being and frankly, just survival, right? Mm-hmm. Back to the question, though, that you asked around our customers, you know, what hasn't changed is there's those that are self-employed, whether it's the pool guy or the pool girl or the folks that just the one woman, one man shops. That hasn't changed. Those are self-employed. But then what has changed is what I mentioned earlier. You run into a lot of folks around the globe, by the way, it's not just in the US, where they have a full-time job, but they're either doing a side gig as a designer through Upwork, or they're Lyft or Uber drivers, and that changes the tenor of how they even think about managing their personal versus business expenses. Do I wait till tax time to pay all my taxes, or when I get all this income, that's side income, do I need to pay taxes now? And then there are those
not to mention deductions and pass-throughs and
that's exactly
growth
right.
Business, right?
That's exactly right. And then there are those that gentlemen over there ask, what will the world look like in 2035? Your guess is as good as mine, but we think one part of the world will be, or a big population will be, folks that are just doing a bunch of different gig works. And just in terms of how you find work, the stability of income, how you manage your personal versus business deductions, how much you put to the side, how you connect with insurance and benefits is just a massive change that we're seeing. And so we think about that in terms of then how do we create a platform that helps put more money in the pocket of these workers? How do we eliminate the drudgery work and drive automation so they can focus on what they're passionate about? And so those are some of the key insights, which I don't think is any different than what the panel has actually already shared.
Yeah, but I think you're raising a question that's very important. And Sheila, I'd love to hear you talk about this. You have an initiative going in your company to help bring workers who are on-demand workers, essentially care workers who, what's the average, $9 an hour for a care worker, and to change that so that they have some support systems that are like the support systems that a full-time job used to provide when you worked for a company. Can you?
Sure. I mean, it's interesting. I know the drivers get a lot of attention in the gig economy, but we have 12 million caregivers on the platform thus far on Care.com, and we felt like it was our social responsibility, because it's such an undervalued part of society. So we provide household payroll so that they can get access to Social Security and other benefits to families. We also provide workers' compensation in all 50 states. Took us 4 years to build that, because families are so confused to say, I'm hiring someone for my home. What's workers' comp? How do I even do this. Provide access to healthcare through a partnership we did with Stride. And then we launched for the first time the first ever pooled portable benefits platform. It's a little bit of conscious capitalism. So for every transaction, we actually put 2% of Care.com's fees towards towards the caregiver as a benefit, and then another 2% that we ask the family to give. And that's up to $600 a year. But that, if you think about a corporate benefit, is equivalent to annually a pharmacy benefit. And they can use that money towards premiums and currently roll it over even to a subsequent year. And so we're trying to create this sandbox role modeling. Byron and I have spoken on panels together and finding ways to work to how do you create the social net that is so necessary? And then on top of that, it's not just even benefits. How do they get access to training and retraining so that they have career pathways, that caregiving is just a stepping stone so that they can actually go into home health aid, into nursing, because there's a shortage there too in the country. So there's ways in which we can really use the power of the platforms for reach. Because the problem with a lot of nonprofits and some of the for-profits is the challenge of distribution. So as a consumer platform, we feel it's our responsibility to actually do that advocacy and reach and use the power of technology without charging, specifically because we already monetize in a different way. How do we create a social net specifically for caregivers?
So before we go away from that, among the families who use Care.com to find caregivers, what's been the uptake of these things you're offering? So in other words, if I hire a housekeeper, I get an option of whether to pay minimum wage, or I can just talk to that housekeeper offline and say, you know, really, it's going to be $9 an hour. Do you want the job? So what can you talk about what the mix is?
We haven't because we're public, but what we've done is it's part of our initiative, what we call Care 3.0. For a long time, we built the matching platform, so millions of matches and a high efficacy. It's a 90% match rate on Care.com. Now what we're doing is building what we call Beyond the Match, which is Care 3.0. Once you've matched on Care.com, what kinds of things could we be providing for you, additional services, so whether you hired on Care or not. And that's the fastest way we can actually get to advocacy, so that we're in the relationship, asking them to really treat the caregiver in the right way.
Interesting. Byron.
You know, just listening, it always seems to me like the gig economy worker, the contingent worker, is really should better be thought of almost like a canary in the coal mine for the entire workforce, in the sense that the challenges that that contingent workers face are actually challenges that many other workers who are not contingent face. And I think we underestimate the degree to which our institutions are problematic, even for many that are in the full paid workforce. And I just think it's just easier to spot in the contingent workforce. So for example, if you talk about the challenge of scheduling these different gigs and how do you manage all of those, well, we have almost 20 million American workers that are technically full-time that are on scheduling platforms for their companies that optimize their company's convenience. And they could, you know, on 4 hours notice after they've arranged childcare and they've not gone to the community college class that would have helped them get to a better place, they just don't have the shift. Right, they find out at the last minute, right, and that happens all over to 20 million people. So that's a good example there. You talk about the training, right, and the lack of training in the gig economy. Well, I'll tell you, it used to be that it was pretty standard to train people across the board, and companies still do. But right now, the difference between if you get into an entry, you start coming out of, say, a selective university into entry-level professional, managerial, or technical, then your company puts a lot of training behind you with the intention of having you move up. But if you start on the retail floor, if you start in the call center, if you start in the warehouse, you're probably being trained for safety, compliance, and efficiency. There are exceptions. There's companies that still do a lot of that training, but it's a real issue. And then even the tax challenges of dealing with the tax code being biased in some ways against contingent workers. Well, the tax code is biased against work, period. Right? If you try to accomplish the same, if a company has a new product or service and they try to deliver it, let's say by deploying lean and sort of training their workers to do it, and empowered teams, cross training, and they same cash in, cash out, they do it with machines and software instead and take out workers, they have a huge tax benefit, even though it's the same cash in, same cash out, same economic efficiency. If you do it by training people and employing them, you will have a lower accounting earnings, you'll have a lower PE ratio, you'll have lower executive bonuses. So we have absolutely biased our institutions, our major institutions of capitalism, against work across the board, not just contingent work, any work. By humans, that is. Just humans. The rest is fine.
I see a question here.
Hi, thank you. This is a great discussion. I'm Lisa Newberger from Accenture, and the topic that you just raised, Byron, is something that I was going to raise as a puzzling point. So what puzzles me is about reskilling, upskilling, retraining. So you see the big companies like Accenture, like GE, like Daimler, like Toyota, investing heavily in massive retraining, reskilling initiatives right at this moment. But who's reskilling the workforce who works in small and medium-sized enterprises and the gig economy? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on where are the green shoots. Peggy Pritzker, spoke about the green shoots that are coming up in this space of retraining, and where are we seeing that in the workforce of SMEs and the gig economy, and what kinds of solutions do you see?
Well, can I interrupt to throw in another gloomy factor? Byron, you were talking about this earlier. At the same time these pressures are on the workforce, employers, and Paul, I don't know if you see this among the people you work with, seem to be getting more and more conservative and risk-averse in hiring. There's what's called up-credentialing, where you'll advertise a job and you'll say only BAs accepted, where the job doesn't require a BA. Or the slightest smudge on a worker's record, you can collect 2,000 resumes where you used to be able to collect 40. And of those 2,000, you apply the most brutal filters. So you end up with somebody who's probably overqualified for the actual job and stiffing people who really could use the work and would be just right for the job. And so there's a distortion that seemed to be happening on the employer's side, and I can't explain it. I have no direct experience with it, but I was hoping someone here could shed light on that.
Yeah, so I'll try a little bit. So there's a couple themes going around. So Cognizant employs 260,000 people or so. And so that we have, and other large companies, like you just said, like GE, Accenture, there are engines for collecting, for information, for training. I mean, these large companies, it's incumbent on them on all of us, to make sure that we are taking the appropriate steps to get people skilled for digital economy jobs. To not do that, there's an economic imperative. There's an innovation imperative, and there's an ethical imperative. And most successful big companies that we work with, there's not anybody that's just going, nope, not going to do it. Training is a bad idea. I've never heard that, not once. But another point that's come up, I think, to the notion of the tax code being, creating a downward pressure on humans. I think that's true if we assume that throughput is the same. The idea of AI and automation being applied, and this is happening across multiple sectors, whether it's in the industrial internet or technology services or banking or pick an industry, or healthcare, is that if you lower costs, the actual cost of the means of production, the market will decide that will ensure that there's more throughput. So the dystopian future that is painted frequently is that demand is fixed. And that's not right? That's never been right. Like, you can go back to Henry Ford, you can go back to, there are plenty of historical examples. But the idea that if the cost goes down, you can, and we're doing work in a hospital, actually, where we help improve throughput, and now they're serving more patients. So the cost did go down, but nobody left, In fact, they're growing because it's more efficient, it's more effective. And I think that's part of this equation. We can get very easily, especially in kind of the post-lunch sugar crash that we're all kind of living through right now. It's like, oh God, the robots are coming. We're all just,
Maybe
at least the view is nice. But the point of this is, though, it's not necessarily a dystopian. There's a utopian, the utopians, and we're Silicon Valley, so I'm fully cognizant, pun intended, on where we are. They're saying, like, technology is going to make everything perfect forever. And then, you've got other folks, they're raising important points, not to, Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking are raising important questions, but they're highly dystopian. It's like, let's just build a fire and end it. But then there's a pragmatic middle here that is much more plausible and historically justified.
Okay, so let's stay with that, though. But something Deanna said at the beginning is you have to tease apart the different segments.
Absolutely right.
And Byron, you made the point that used to be that the labor market worked for 80% of the workforce. And now it only seems to work well for 50% of the workforce. And I didn't quite understand what you meant.
Well, you can debate the percentages, and I know we haven't gotten to your question yet, but I'm sure
but we're circling.
We'll circle around to the training. But I just want to respond to Paul because I have actually a very the point I was making about the way our system is biased against labor, like partly the tax code, but actually more the accounting code, even more so than the tax system. It's actually FASB accounting, which interestingly is not a government thing per se; it's a nonprofit, right? But it's an industry standard. But it is that it's not. I'm not saying that there's not going to be enough demand. I'm actually quite optimistic on that point. To my earlier point, there is so much work to do. There's tremendous amount to do. I mean, we talked about caring. We haven't talked much about infrastructure. We haven't talked much about travel and tourism and new experiences. So I mean, as well as medicine and new cures. I mean, there's so much work to do. So I'm not at all pessimistic about the demand side of things, like the aggregate demand, the absolute demand for new things for humans. However, it's not the market. It's not just that the market decides. This is mediated very much through institutions. So my point about, in general, technology, I think, tends to be neutral, right? It can be, you can use it in all sorts of ways. A hammer can smash your head or it can build a house. It just depends on what you do with it. AI actually, and what you're seeing right now in the next 20 years, classification, all that, I don't think it's neutral. I think it wants to augment people, right? It's mainly growing it's mainly taking off in ways that are parts of jobs, not entire jobs. And yet, if you look at the way it will flow through our business models, our capital markets, and the like, it's very likely to be used in most places as just another form of automation, where it really could be a massive form of augmentation. Where you will see it used in augmentation is in healthcare. Why? Not because the market decides, but because the guilds are strong, right? You can't replace doctors. The AMA won't allow you to, right, sort of change that. So therefore, we'll use it to enhance, right, what doctors can do, their effectiveness, and so forth. But we could also use it to enhance what nurse practitioners could do, what home health care aides could do. Except it bounces up against the scope of practice laws that says a home health care aide can only do so much, no matter if she's augmented by technology or not. So it's not a matter of just the markets. It's very much a matter of our laws and institutions and our political economy that determines how technology flows through and how it affects whose job. So I just wanted to think we can't expect markets don't descend from heaven, the clouds part. They're human institutions. We create them, and we need to create them better in the way that they work for more people.
Can I address the training Lisa asked? Is that okay?
Please.
So I actually think it's got to be both sides on the supply and demand side. So in terms of the gig economy, so the way we think about it is we're launching the CARE Institute, which is a separate 501c3 partnered with the AARP, rolling it out later this year, that really trains caregivers across the country, hoping to partner with Byron, so a lot of work to do there. But then there's also, what are we doing for families? Because if you're solving the supply issue, there's a lot of low-income workers. Byron touched on retail workers, whether they're at banks, McDonald's. If we're only servicing the white-collar workers, then we're not really going to support overall productivity. But how can they afford that? So affordable care, so what we're doing is actually training as well. It's called Home Start, training family daycare providers, low-income immigrant women, to run their own businesses so that they can serve the local community, especially when it comes to backup care, when there's poor, it's really difficult scheduling of retail workers. They can just call a local community, a family daycare to serve their needs. So there's a lot of solutions out there, and how do we take public-private partnerships using the power of technology to actually solve some of these things? And a lot of these programs have been in existence, but you can't actually fill a family daycare. And we realize the powerofcare.com is, we train these women, we spend a lot of dollars training them, but a lot of nonprofits are just fed up. They because the women decide after a year they're going to leave that profession because they can't fill their local daycare. And so where can we play as technology to provide a solution? Again, it's that combination of HI and AI that has to come together on both sides.
Can I add to this? Because I actually think your question is a really good one where I'll provide a part perspective, and I think there's other elements that will get answered over time because I don't think we know. As I mentioned earlier, we have 8,000 full-time employees. At our peak every year, we add another 7,000, and they're all contingent workers. And what we do is we bring them in and we train them. We train them to deliver for our customers. This is in our customer success organization. At the end, we do exit interviews with every single one of them. One, what was their experience with us? What can we do better? And then provide them input in terms of where they can go get more training and specifically suggest where they can get it. So I think we collectively can play an enormous part in that. We do the same when we hire contingent designers, product managers, when we have peaks, engineers. You want that to be core, but we also provide training and also suggest where they get training. That's the perspective that at least we know today. There's a huge perspective that I think goes unanswered, which leaves it a lot to, you have to be self-directed to get your own training. I mean, all these folks that are doing different gigs, how are they going through and getting themselves skilled and trained to do a great job? That's something that we have to actually figure out collectively over time. But I think there's a lot we can do to provide that training like you're doing, which is wonderful, to skill the workforce.
Yeah, this is the main thing that I'm working on now with Opportunity at Work, which we founded 2 years ago. In the White House, this was one of my domain areas, that sort of training, workforce training. And I would agree with everything we heard here, that there's, first of all, a lot of companies do a very good job. Certainly many companies do an excellent job with their own workforce. And many companies try to do, extend that a bit into the community in terms of partnerships alike. And there are many that are effective. Cognizant and its peers, for example, in IT services, are tremendously effective at sort of training people. So to the point that Peter mentioned, so I think there's really three things that if you want to talk about how to take these things to scale, beyond a few apprenticeships here and there, which, I mean, there are so many good things that if you add it all up, there's no way they can get to more than, say, 15% of the need. Every good thing in every way that it could work that you see out there. We need to have a different model that can take the good and sort of scale it. And I think there's three things that matter here. Number one, you have to have more people have access to those career path jobs. And this is to your point. If we say that you have to have a bachelor's degree to do a job, that you didn't learn anything in your bachelor's degree to do that job. You're just using it as a very crude signal. If we are going to equate someone's skills, someone's potential, to how much educational attainment they have in a society where educational attainment of that sort requires social capital, it requires savings, it requires money. It has all sorts of things that don't correlate to talent.
It's a very blunt.
We are defining ourselves into a skills gap. I mean, at most, a really insane example: 20% of administrative assistants have bachelor's degrees, but 2/3 of the new job postings last year for administrative assistants require a bachelor's degree to be considered. Right, so 80% of today's admin assistants can't apply for their own job for 2/3 of the new jobs in their field. But you know what else for administrative assistants? In Opportunity at Work, we're seeing a lot of admin assistants from small businesses who don't have an IT department. These businesses, they are the IT department. They've mastered these things, but now try to apply for a career path job in IT, you won't get into the interview. Right, because you will be screened out through the applicant tracking system before any human has seen you, before anyone has assessed what you can do. So the first thing is you have to have a system where it's show what you can do, and our jobs will look for you. And that's what we're doing first in Opportunity at Work. We have a network of, right now, about 1,400 employers, and we're starting with IT jobs. We have 3 up on techhire.careers, and it's moving. But we work with the employers to develop these assessments. We have a network of interviewers who are volunteers, who are the same person who might interview you for a job at Amazon, but now it's giving you a 30-minute mock interview where you get in the pool to be hired if you get through. And if you don't, you get feedback specifically on what you should work on, which you can't get in an actual job interview if you could get one. So that's critical. And then second, you have this network now can start to define, here are the skills you need to be able to do these jobs, so that training providers of all sorts now have a target to shoot at. Businesses say that training, education don't know what skills we need. Well, how would they know what skills you need if you don't tell them, right? You tell your suppliers your specifications, right? But you don't, this is like suppliers of your talent. You don't tell them your specifications, but you can do that with a network. And then third, the kind of innovation we talk about at Techonomy, which is applying right now in the talent tech to, at the top of the market to create these super empowered free agents, and for companies to sort of, you know, plug in your people like widgets. We need that technology for individuals all the way down to the most marginal individual to be agents, right? To be agents, to actually support them, negotiate on their behalf, figure out how to plug in their training. And we're just starting to do that with that network, because you start to see what skills do you need to take the next step.
Wow.
So companies together, companies individually, like you mentioned with Intuit, can make a difference, but companies together can make a massive difference, because if the millions of people who apply for jobs at big companies and are screened out and get this electronic form letter, and they also got a link to a place, well, hey, we're not, you don't qualify based on your pedigree, but hey, try here and see if you can qualify based on your performance. And you always have a way. If there's always a lane where you can be screened in based on performance, not screened out based on pedigree, then we can get started for people turning their effort and their learning into earning.
Okay, there's an issue I promised we would get back to, and that is the mystery. It's a job creation mystery, and it's the mystery of business formation. And Deanna, I know you've flagged that as the biggest puzzle. So,
well, I could touch on that, but I did notice there were at least 3 people who've been trying to get in the whole time, and I just feel like with 5 minutes left, we should.
Okay, so let's harvest some questions.
And then I'll try to answer your question.
Okay, so let's take the 3 questions, and then we'll.
Great.
Okay, so over.
I know that gentleman in the back has his hand up forever.
And this gentleman up here.
Oh my God, I'm sorry.
Not at all. This is an awesome panel. No apologies, please.
Okay.
I actually did have a question that was primarily for Diana and for Paul, though I'd love to hear the entire panel's opinion on it. Clearly, we're experiencing the law of unintended consequences. I remember 4 or 5 years ago, conferences on the future of work where you had companies like LinkedIn and WeWork very confidently predicting exactly what to expect. And this entire panel is now about the opposite. So my question is, where are the biggest blind spots we have about the future? Where is it most important to be tracking the data and looking for emerging trends? Assuming that we are actually flying through the fog right now, what are those signs, those indicators, those KPIs? Where does data, where does analysis most help us chart the future, like one day at a time? Where are the blind spots? What should we be looking at?
Well, I think you should go, and then I'll agree with you.
Well, we've got very data-intensive people here, so.
Did you want to take the questions, or?
I want to take the questions. Thank you. Yes. Okay. So that's one. Who has the mic? There you go.
Yeah. So what I'm worried about is sort of the downward trend on what you could think of the bottom end of the middle class. And there's sort of 3 forces you talked about, and I'm just worried about what we do about it, right? Because it feels to me, to listen to the story you're describing, it will continue, right? So one of them is more and more people moving to care work, but we actually don't value it, and therefore more and more people doing important stuff but actually not getting paid very well. Mm-hmm. The second is what you raised, which is actually because we qualify people for jobs, actually people are getting paid less than they should given the thing they've gotten, and therefore there's a downward progress. And then the third is, I think, Diana, the point you're raising, which is we aren't creating the companies that actually create the work that then create the next generation of wealth. And so I think the worry I have that's dystopian, the worry I have is that a larger and larger percentage of the population is getting to a point where their lives are less and less attractive for those 3 forces. And so I'm just curious about your thoughts about how to respond to that challenge. And I think I'd like your answer first, I guess, because creating new businesses is a huge piece of it.
That is a very eloquent question. Thank you. Okay, I'll take one more.
Just a quick add to that right here.
Yep.
Is we've talked a lot about outside the company, but inside the firm, right? We do a lot of development for large firms, and engagement scores are way down. And when you talk to people, it's because, well, I get my medical here, and I've been here for 15 years. If I can just hold on for another 5, even though it's shit work, it's better going into the gig economy because I heard that sucks. So I think there's another side, which is the kind of corporate bureaucracy and hierarchy that we live in. There's some that navigate to the top and are these superhuman, float around and do super cool stuff. And then there's like the unwashed middle that just kind of are droning around hoping just to kind of get by. And I think there's a lot of cognitive surplus that needs to be unlocked in there too. So it seems there's a story, there's a double story here to picking off what Blair's saying. Inside the corporate bureaucracy, there's kind of latent potential locked up. In the gig economy, there's this kind of fluctuation and variability. And if you ask the people in the corporation, they just love to go and do their startup thing, to Diana's point, but they don't like the volatility. And for those who are in the volatility, we're trying to create stability. So I'm back to Paul's magic middle. There's probably something in the middle where both sides could see benefit in creating some kind of marketplace.
Okay, we have one more question. Yes, sir.
So, yeah, my name's Gary Bowles. I'm the chair for the future of work at Singularity University, and we have a startup e-parachute built off the work of a
So this is your
college
wheelhouse,
parachute.
right?
So it's my favorite topic. So I just want to play off of something that Byron was saying. So not only is our legislative system biased against work, but the Silicon Valley innovation machine, to some extent, is biased against it as well. You've got venture capitalists funding innovation, which is basically to go automate tasks that humans are performing, because that's the money that's being spent today. But if we don't take that same amount of innovation that's being focused on replacing work and focus it on augmenting and upskilling people, the results are kind of inevitable. So we have this massive machine that could be turned towards, providing a lot of the same kind of upskilling and rapid training and even embedding training within work. But the machine's not calibrated towards that right now. So thoughts on how to change that?
Okay. So Deanna.
Okay, in 1 minute or less. Let me. There's so many good questions, and we won't handle them all. But let's come back to this startup issue. I don't think we have good explanations, and I think if we spent more time thinking about that, we would unlock a lot of things that would help unleash many dimensions of the problem. One of the things that people like to say, and I think John Chambers this morning was saying some bit of this, it's this sort of creeping regulation that has prohibited entrepreneurship. I don't think he used those words, but I'm very skeptical of that argument, because we have natural experiments across the country where some states are highly regulated, some states are relatively lowly regulated, and you think of California, it's one of the most highly regulated states, and you actually have higher startup rates here. So I'm sort of skeptical of the creeping regulation argument. I think there's the Walmartization argument that killed the moms and pops, and maybe now the Amazonification. And
platforms absorbing the
just scale wiping out sort of lots of mom and pops that were subscale but that exist in a different plane. And there's no doubt there's been a lot of that. But it's also true that those are places that have given rise to startups as suppliers and others. So there's not a foregone conclusion that that model would have to end up with the decimation of startups, et cetera. There's a psychological argument that says millennials are just not risk takers and baby boomers were, or that we're just an older society. And again, I could piece that apart if you had the time to work through it. And so it really comes back.
Your institute's funded by a bank. What about credit?
So I would say that that's part of the regulatory argument that says what businesses lack is credit, and that's a result of the kind of capital weights that are put on providing risk to high-risk companies, and you can blame the banks or you can blame the regulation, but you're back to kind of a story of regulation. And then there's another maybe more optimistic argument that says, no, what's happened is that a lot of the marginal value to an entrepreneur today of going to start up something on their own versus going to a large company that is increasingly allowing entrepreneurship within those companies is what's changed. So that if you were modeling the ways in which JP Morgan Chase is funding like all these entrepreneurs who are figuring out what to do with blockchain technology, et cetera, within a bank, for example, in another world they might have been outside. So I don't know. That's the latest new theory I've seen. I think there's some value to that. But I think that only applies to the highly educated person who would be attracted by that these companies would likely employ, and not the broad range of people you were describing, Byron, who are really entrepreneurial and they'll figure out how to do the IT system even though they didn't have an IT training, et cetera, who also are attaching themselves to large companies, whether or not they're getting that entrepreneurial spirit. And I do think that if we had a different view about it, that this is a much more beneficial thing to our country, even if it required subsidizing capital, even if it required subsidizing labor while people are in those jobs, we would begin to unlock that, which I think is going to be really essential. I mean, even today, small businesses are nearly 50% of employment.
Right.
So it's a big issue.
Our time clock up here is failing, but I have one here.
Yeah,
We're about out of time. So let me just ask a quick closing question of all of you. And that would be, if it's a takeaway question. So if there were one thing you would like to see business do, or government do, or individuals do to improve these issues that we're talking about and get employment into job market into a better place, what would the assignment be?
So I just said what I thought business should do, and that it's that this sort of joining what Opportunity at Work is doing, sort of almost a talent alliance. But so I'm going to take my minute to answer these questions, if you don't mind.
Okay, no. Well, I want to let people answer that question, then we'll go back to that, okay?
Okay, great.
What is the one thing I think we need to redefine the value of work? Not just the care question that you raised, Sheila, but the ways in which we bias against the entrepreneurship that comes from pulling together independent work and otherwise. So I think a redefinition in our policy structure around what work is.
That's a policy answer, but it has to be deep and
I think so.
through. Okay.
You know, I'll focus my comments on just, again, those that are self-employed, which includes the one man or woman shop and or those that are doing a number of different gigs. And I would just say that our entire system globally is wired for those that work at companies that get paychecks. And I think we have...
It's the W-2 people, not the 1099 people.
That's right. And we should think about the 1099 folks, from how they get paid to the training that's provided to insurance to benefits, and think about how we focus on putting more money in their pocket, eliminating work and drudgery, and eliminating the fear that they have. Okay. So they can thrive in that environment, because that future is here.
That's
and
great.
It's only going to
Thank you.
expand.
Sheila?
So I think building on valuing work and also valuing 1099, certainly I'd like to propose valuing caregivers, but you guys already know I represent that advocacy. But it's actually asking you as individuals. You are incredibly talented, highly educated, have a ton of resources, and the fact is you can be a force for systemic change, to challenge the institutions, to challenge your definitions, to challenge how we do all these things in the approach of what technology is going to happen to humanity. And so I think we all have an individual responsibility to use that purpose-driven creativity that is so human in all of us to make a meaningful difference.
Paul?
It's almost the same thing with that you just said. It's the big thing. I mean, we talk to companies all over the world, policymakers, to boil it down to one thing, one recommendation that I would have based on all the research and everything that we've been able to look at is don't short human imagination. It's been a bad bet throughout history. It's a bad bet now, and it will continue to be a bad bet. So whether you're on the dystopian tribe or the utopian tribe, there is a pragmatic middle there, and the ticket to entry to that way ahead is don't short human imagination. To go on the one side, it's like you would overbet on the obligation of the nobles to sort everything out, and on the other hand, you've got revolution in the streets. The middle is possible, it's plausible, and it's up to us to make it happen, but it will never happen if we short human imagination.
Paul, if it's a policy recommendation, though, it's really putting meaningful work first. So I agree with Deanna, but I think it's if you look at the actual regulation and then practices, business practices that we don't call regulation, but are just as meaningful restrictions on people's lives. When you say that an administrative assistant who's been doing the job for 6 years has to quit and go back to school for 4 years in order to maybe get the same job later, that feels like a regulation to that person. That person is stuck as a result. And we say California is regulated, but California does not have non-compete agreements, and other states do. So the dynamism of California might be because high taxes don't matter as much as a fluid labor market, and California has a more fluid labor market for talent because of those things.
Obviously, this debate will go on in future tech economies. I want to thank everyone here, Paul, Sheila, Sasan, Deanna, Byron, and thank you all for your questions. It's been great.